I'm Jessica, 32, and I built my real estate portfolio from nothing while watching my parents favor my sister Madison at every turn. I never expected their manipulation would extend to publicly announcing I'd gift Madison one of my hard-earned apartments, without ever asking me. The silence in that dining room when I finally stood up with my glass raised still echoes in my mind. Their faces turned ghostly pale as I carefully dismantled their lies with each word of my toast. Before I tell you how I exposed my family's manipulation, drop a comment about where you're watching from and subscribe if you've ever dealt with family favoritism. Trust me, this story might give you the courage you need. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in South Boston, our family looked picture-perfect from the outside. My father Robert worked as an accountant at a respected firm, while my mother Eleanor taught second grade at the local elementary school. We lived in a modest colonial with a small yard where neighborhood kids would gather. From a distance, we were the ideal American family, but inside our home, the dynamics told a different story. Madison came into the world 4 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, it was clear she'd be the golden child. She had these big blue eyes and blonde curls that made strangers stop my mother in the grocery store. I had my father's darker features and more serious demeanor. "Your sister is just more delicate," my mother would say whenever I questioned the differences in how we were treated. The pattern started small. At Christmas, Madison's pile of presents towered over mine. When I pointed this out at age 9, my father said, "Jessica, you're older. You should understand that Madison needs more right now." That became the refrain of my childhood. I needed to understand, to be mature, to make allowances. By middle school, the favoritism had crystallized into our family culture. Madison struggled with math, and my parents hired expensive tutors. When I needed help with my science fair project, they told me I was smart enough to figure it out myself. I earned straight A's through self-discipline while Madison's C+ grades were celebrated like academic achievements. "Look how hard she tried," my mother would exclaim, pinning Madison's mediocre test results to the refrigerator alongside my honor roll certificates. The summer before high school, I wanted to attend a writing camp that cost $400. My parents said they couldn't afford it. 2 weeks later, they surprised Madison with an $800 guitar and private lessons because she mentioned, once, that she thought music might be kind of cool. The guitar collected dust in her closet within a month. I stopped asking for things and started babysitting at 14, saving every dollar. By 16, I was working 20 hours a week at the local bookstore while maintaining my GPA. Madison, meanwhile, bounced between extracurricular activities, quitting each one when it required actual effort. My parents called her a free spirit discovering her path. I was too focused on achievement. College marked the most glaring disparity. I received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities but chose State University because of their scholarship offering. Even with that financial assistance, I worked 2 jobs, at the campus library and waiting tables on weekends, to cover my expenses. I graduated with minimal debt and a degree in business administration. Madison, on the other hand, took 2 gap years to find herself, which consisted mainly of sleeping until noon and taking expensive art classes she never completed. When she finally attended college, my parents paid her full tuition at a private university, covered her apartment in the trendy part of town, and provided a generous monthly allowance. She changed majors 3 times and took 5.5 years to graduate with a degree in communications. Throughout those years, I discovered my passion for real estate. My economics professor mentioned property investment in a lecture, and something clicked. I researched obsessively, attended free seminars, and shadowed a local realtor on weekends. By my senior year, I had a 5-year plan. After graduation, I lived with 3 roommates in a tiny apartment, saving every possible penny. I worked at a property management company during the day and as a virtual assistant at night. When I mentioned my real estate ambitions during Sunday dinner, my father laughed. "That's a tough business, Jessica. Maybe look for something more stable." A week later, he gave Madison $5,000 to start a small online boutique selling imported scarves. The business failed within 3 months because she lost interest. At 24, after 2 years of aggressive saving and building my credit, I made my first property purchase, a rundown duplex in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I lived in one unit and rented the other, covering most of my mortgage. Nights and weekends were spent renovating, learning plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos to save money. When I invited my parents to see the finished renovation, my mother walked through with pursed lips. "It's interesting," she said, eyeing the exposed brick wall I'd spent 3 weekends uncovering and restoring. "But don't you think you're taking on too much responsibility? You're always so serious." That same month, they attended Madison's spoken word performance, her newest interest, and took the entire family out to celebrate afterward, my father calling her our little artist with tears in his eyes. I stopped seeking their approval and focused entirely on building my business. The first property led to a second, then a third. I quit my day job at 27 to focus on real estate full-time. Each acquisition became easier as I built equity and relationships with lenders. I developed a reputation for finding undervalued properties and maximizing their potential. By 30, I owned 7 properties and had established JL Properties LLC. I hired my first employee, purchased an office space, and expanded into commercial real estate. My portfolio was valued at over $3 million, all self-made, without a single dollar from my parents. At family gatherings, my success was acknowledged with brief, uncomfortable nods. "Jessica's doing well with her buildings," my father would say before quickly changing the subject. Meanwhile, Madison's temporary job at a marketing firm was discussed in extensive detail, with my parents soliciting advice from every family member on how she could advance. I learned to find validation elsewhere. In my growing business, my relationship with my boyfriend Derek, and the small circle of loyal friends who understood my journey. I built a life I was proud of, despite rather than because of my family's support. But the scars of constantly being second best, of never being enough despite my achievements, ran deep. What I didn't realize was that my success was setting the stage for their most audacious act of favoritism yet. The catalyst for everything that followed was Madison's breakup with Tyler, her boyfriend of 3 years. They'd met at a music festival, moved in together after 4 months, and had the kind of relationship that seemed to exist primarily on Instagram, all filtered photos and inspirational captions about soulmates. Tyler was a freelance graphic designer who actually made decent money, covering most of their living expenses while Madison jumped between marketing jobs, never staying anywhere longer than 8 months. Their apartment in the city was beautiful. Exposed beams, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a rooftop deck. Madison constantly posted photos of her perfect life, and my parents shared every single one. The breakup came suddenly. Madison discovered Tyler had been working closely with his ex-girlfriend on a major project, too closely. She moved out the same day, leaving behind most of her furniture and taking their shared dog, a French bulldog named Banksy that Tyler had actually purchased. At 32, I owned a thriving real estate company with 2 full-time employees and a portfolio of 12 properties across residential and commercial sectors. I'd recently purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom condo in one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods. My relationship with Derek, a structural engineer I'd met during a renovation project 2 years prior, was solid and supportive. We weren't in a rush toward marriage but had discussed a future together. Madison, now 28, moved back into our parents' house with her emotional support dog and 6 suitcases of clothes. She spent the first month crying on the couch, ordering takeout on our parents' credit card, and posting cryptic quotes about betrayal on social media. "She's heartbroken," my mother explained during one of our bi-weekly phone calls. "You know how sensitive she is." I made sympathetic noises while reviewing property comparables for a potential new acquisition. I'd learned long ago that my parents didn't actually want my input, they wanted my agreement that Madison needed special treatment. After the initial breakdown phase, Madison started talking about finding herself again and healing through creativity. This manifested as expensive art therapy sessions, a pottery class she attended twice, and a weekend retreat for spiritual reconnection that cost my parents $1,200. The hint started about 2 months after she moved home. Madison really needs her own space to heal properly, my mother mentioned during Sunday dinner. Your father and I love having her, but at her age, she needs independence. I nodded noncommittally and changed the subject. A week later, my father called to catch up about my business, something he rarely showed interest in. Those apartments downtown, the ones you renovated last year, they're doing well? He asked. The Baker Street units? Yes, they're fully rented with great tenants, I replied, immediately suspicious of his sudden interest. And you own, how many properties now? 12. I'm closing on a small commercial building next month. That's quite something, Jessica, he said, his tone indicating he was still processing the extent of my success. You know, your sister has been talking about getting back on her feet. Finding a new apartment in the city. And there it was. The rental market is competitive right now, I said carefully. But I can recommend some good areas in her price range. Well, that's just it. After the breakup, her credit took a hit. Tyler's name was on most of their bills. And you know how expensive security deposits are these days. I remained silent, waiting for him to make the actual request. He cleared his throat. Your mother and I were thinking, since you have multiple properties, maybe you could help your sister out. Just temporarily, of course. You want me to find her a place? I asked, deliberately obtuse. More like, perhaps one of your units might be coming available? Something she could move into? Family rate? His voice had the same cajoling tone he'd used when asking me to let Madison borrow my car in high school, the car I'd purchased with my own money. Madison had returned it with an empty tank and a mysterious dent she didn't know anything about. Dad, I don't actually have any vacancies right now. All my properties are occupied with lease agreements. Oh. His disappointment was palpable. Well, perhaps when something opens up, you could keep Madison in mind? As a priority tenant? I promised to let them know if anything became available, knowing that I had no intention of renting to Madison. I'd worked too hard building relationships with reliable tenants to risk bringing in someone with financial instability and a history of irresponsibility, family or not. The hints continued for weeks. My mother mentioned how one of her friends had given her daughter an apartment as a graduation gift. My father sent me articles about Boston's unaffordable housing market. Madison herself started texting me to catch up over coffee, something she'd never shown interest in before. During one such coffee meeting, Madison casually mentioned that she'd driven past my Baker Street property. Those are really nice buildings, she said, stirring her $7 lavender latte that I'd paid for. The brick facade is so charming. Which unit is vacant? None of them are vacant, I replied. I have a waiting list of potential tenants if someone moves out. Her face fell momentarily before she recovered. Oh, I just thought since Dad mentioned, never mind. So how's Derek? I changed the subject but left the coffee shop unsettled. The coordinated pressure campaign was escalating, and I had a feeling I knew where it was heading. The upcoming family gathering was supposedly to celebrate my father's retirement from the accounting firm after 35 years. My mother had planned a formal dinner at their house, inviting extended family, my father's brother Uncle James and his wife Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister Aunt Sarah with her husband Uncle David and their college-aged twins, and my grandmother from my mother's side. I brought Derek for moral support, sensing I might need an ally. He had met my family several times and understood the dynamics at play. Just remember, their opinion doesn't define your worth, he whispered as we approached the house, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. The evening started with cocktails in the living room. I noticed Madison wearing a new dress and showing Aunt Sarah photos on her phone. My mother fluttered around in a state of heightened excitement, refreshing drinks and urging everyone to try her homemade appetizers. My father seemed uncharacteristically nervous, checking his watch and clearing his throat repeatedly. During these observations, I caught several family members giving me strange glances followed by whispered conversations. Uncle James patted my shoulder with unusual affection, saying, "You've done so well for yourself, Jessica. It's good to see success doesn't change some people's generosity. I had no idea what he was referring to but smiled politely and moved on. Similar cryptic comments came from Aunt Patricia and my grandmother, all hinting at some knowledge I wasn't privy to. Is it just me, or is everyone acting weird? I whispered to Derek as we moved to the dining room. Definitely weird, he confirmed. Your aunt just asked me how I feel about Jessica's big gesture. What gesture? An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as we took our seats at the elaborately decorated dining table. Madison was placed at my father's right hand, the position of honor, while I was seated further down between my cousins. The table settings were formal, with my mother's best china and crystal glasses at each place. Whatever this retirement dinner was about, it had been planned with unusual care. As the main course was served, my father stood up to make a toast. He spoke about his years at the firm, thanked my mother for her support, and then, with a significant glance in my direction, his tone changed. And before we go any further with our celebration, I want to acknowledge a demonstration of generosity that has truly moved Eleanor and me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As many of you know, our Madison has been going through a difficult transition after her relationship ended. Madison lowered her eyes demurely, accepting the sympathetic glances from around the table. But we're thrilled to announce that she'll be starting fresh in a beautiful new home, thanks to her sister's incredible generosity. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Jessica, my father continued, raising his glass in my direction as my heart began to pound, your mother and I are so proud that you've decided to give Madison one of your downtown apartments. That kind of selfless sisterly love is something we've always hoped to see between you girls. The table erupted in applause and exclamations while I sat in stunned silence, the blood draining from my face. Madison wiped away a theatrical tear, mouthing thank you across the table with a tremulous smile. Derek's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tightly in silent support as family members turned to congratulate me on my extraordinary generosity. The Baker Street apartment, isn't that one of your best properties? Uncle James called out. Madison, you're one lucky sister. I know, Madison replied, her voice catching with emotion. Jessica has always been so successful, and now she's helping me start over. I can't believe how blessed I am. I looked into the expectant faces of my family, all waiting for me to acknowledge the announcement of a gift I had never offered, never discussed, and certainly never agreed to. In that moment, I understood the true depth of my parents' manipulation and entitlement. They hadn't just hinted or asked, they had created a public situation where refusing would make me look heartless. The familiar pressure to accommodate, to maintain peace at my own expense, washed over me. But alongside it came a new feeling, rage, cold, clarifying rage that crystallized years of being undervalued and taken for granted. Excusing myself with a tight smile, I walked to the bathroom on unsteady legs, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to control my breathing. The audacity was staggering. They had announced I was giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars in property, my property, earned through years of work and sacrifice, without even discussing it with me. A soft knock came at the door. Jess? It's me, Derek said quietly. Are you okay? I let him in, collapsing into his arms as soon as the door closed behind him. I can't believe they did this, I whispered, trembling with anger and shock. They just decided I would give Madison an apartment? And announced it to everyone? Derek held me tightly. It's unbelievable. Completely inappropriate. What do you want to do? I pulled back, wiping my eyes and straightening my shoulders. I'm not going along with this. I can't. Of course not, he agreed immediately. But how do you want to handle it? We can leave right now if you want. I considered this option, the easiest in the short term. Leave, cool down, deal with the fallout later in private. But something inside me had reached a breaking point. Years of swallowing my feelings, of accepting less than I deserved, of watching my achievements be minimized while Madison's needs always took precedence, it all converged into a moment of perfect clarity. No, I said, my voice steadying. I'm going to address this right now. publicly, just like their announcement. Derek searched my face. Are you sure? What are you thinking? A plan was already forming in my mind. I'm going to make a toast of my own. I returned to the dining room with Derek close behind, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. The conversation had moved on to my father's retirement plans, a fishing trip to Maine, long-postponed home renovation projects, but I noticed Madison repeatedly glancing at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew I hadn't agreed to this gift. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate ambush. My mother had just served her signature lemon tart when I picked up my water glass and tapped it gently with my spoon. The crystal made a clear, ringing sound that cut through the chatter, drawing all eyes to me. I'd like to make a toast, I announced, standing as conversations fell away into attentive silence. My father beamed, clearly expecting me to formally acknowledge my gift to Madison. My mother clasped her hands together in anticipation. Madison's smile faltered slightly, uncertainty flickering across her face. First, congratulations to Dad on your retirement, I began, raising my glass toward him. 35 years at the same company shows remarkable commitment. Approving murmurs circled the table. So far, so safe. Family gatherings like this make me reflective, I continued, my voice steady despite my racing pulse. They remind me of where we've been and how far we've come. I paused, taking a sip of water to steady myself for what came next. Many of you have congratulated me tonight on my apparent decision to give Madison one of my properties. I kept my tone conversational, though I felt Derek tensing beside me, ready to provide support if needed. I think this is a good opportunity to share the story of how I acquired those properties, since there seems to be some confusion about them. My father's smile began to fade. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I purchased my first property at 24, after working 2 jobs for years to save for the down payment, I said. No one in this room helped me with that purchase. In fact, when I mentioned my interest in real estate, I was discouraged and told it was too risky. The atmosphere in the room changed, discomfort replacing the earlier celebratory mood. That first property was a rundown duplex that I renovated mostly by myself, learning plumbing and electrical work at night after my day job. I lived on ramen noodles and worked 7 days a week to make it happen. I looked directly at Madison, whose eyes had dropped to her plate. Each subsequent property came from the same formula: sacrifice, hard work, and careful planning. No gifts, no financial support, no safety net. Just my own efforts and the income one generated through smart investments. My father cleared his throat. Jessica, we all know you've worked hard. I'm not finished, Dad, I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. Since you chose to make a public announcement about my property, I think it's important everyone has the complete picture. He fell silent, color rising in his face. The downtown Baker Street apartments that were just mentioned? I purchased that building when it was condemned. I secured historic preservation grants, worked with the city on zoning, and personally oversaw the restoration. Those units are now worth 4 times what I paid because of my vision and effort. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each family member. So you can imagine my surprise when it was announced that I'm giving one of these apartments to Madison, something I never agreed to, never discussed, and frankly, never considered. The silence in the room was absolute. My mother's face had drained of color. My father looked as though he'd been struck. Madison stared intently at her dessert, her cheeks flaming red. I've spent my adult life watching my achievements be minimized while being expected to understand why Madison always needed more support, more help, more resources. My voice caught slightly, years of hurt surfacing despite my efforts to remain composed. I accepted that dynamic because I couldn't change it. But I will not allow my hard-earned assets to be distributed without my consent. Aunt Sarah cleared her throat awkwardly. Uncle James studied his water glass with sudden fascination. To be absolutely clear, I continued, my voice strengthening again, I am not giving Madison an apartment. Not now, not in the future. Any discussions about my properties should include me, their owner, before announcements are made to extended family. I raised my glass one final time. So here's to clarity and boundaries. May we all learn to respect them. The silence that followed my toast was deafening. My father's face had turned an alarming shade of gray, while my mother's eyes filled with tears, her go-to response when confronted. Madison appeared to be trying to make herself physically smaller in her chair. I took a sip from my glass and sat down, my hand finding Derek's under the table. He gave me a subtle nod of support, his eyes conveying both pride and concern. Uncle David, always uncomfortable with family tension, attempted to salvage the situation. Well, communications are important in families, he offered weakly. Perhaps there was just a misunderstanding? My father seized on this lifeline. Yes, exactly. A miscommunication. Jessica, your mother, and I thought we had discussed this with you. Perhaps not as explicitly as we should have. We never discussed it at all, I corrected calmly. Not once. Well, we mentioned Madison needed a place, my mother interjected, dabbing at her eyes. And you said you'd help. I offered to recommend affordable neighborhoods, I replied. That's categorically different from giving away a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Grandmother, never one to shy away from uncomfortable truths, shook her head. Robert, Eleanor, did you really announce this without Jessica's agreement? My father loosened his collar, visibly uncomfortable. We thought she would want to help her sister. Jessica has multiple properties, and Madison has none. Because Jessica worked for hers, grandmother pointed out bluntly. I may be old, but even I know you don't give away someone else's things. The remainder of dessert passed in awkward silence, interrupted by forced small talk. Aunt Patricia asked about Uncle James's garden. The twins discussed their college classes. Everyone avoided eye contact with me, my parents, and Madison. As coffee was served, guests began making excuses to leave early. Within 30 minutes, only the immediate family and Derek remained. The tension in the room was suffocating. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, my father finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. That would have been my preference from the beginning, I replied, standing up. Derek, would you mind giving us a few minutes? Are you sure? He asked quietly, concern evident in his eyes. I'm sure. I squeezed his hand. I'll be fine. As Derek stepped outside to wait, my father's controlled facade began to crack. The real confrontation was about to begin. As Derek left the dining room, the artificial politeness that had barely maintained itself in front of the extended family evaporated. My father pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. What the hell was that? He demanded, his face flushed with anger. You completely embarrassed this family in front of everyone. I remained standing, maintaining the physical advantage. Years of being talked down to had taught me the power dynamics of posture. I embarrassed the family? You announced I was giving away my property without my knowledge or consent. How exactly did you think that was going to play out? My mother's tears, which had been at simmer during dessert, now flowed freely. We thought you'd understand once you saw how happy it made Madison. You've always been the responsible one, the one we could count on to do the right thing. And Madison has always been the one you shield from consequences, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger pulsing through me. This isn't about responsibility. This is about respect, or rather, your complete lack of it for me, my work, and my boundaries. Madison, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. I didn't know they hadn't talked to you, she said in a small voice. They told me you had agreed. I turned to her, skepticism evident on my face. Really? So when they told you I was giving you a free apartment worth over $500,000, you didn't think to call and thank me? To ask for details? To confirm directly with me? She flushed, unable to meet my eyes. I thought maybe you wanted it to be a surprise at the dinner. A surprise for whom? I was certainly surprised. The bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Madison, in what world would I give you a property I renovated myself? One that generates significant rental income? One that I have reliable, paying tenants in right now? You have so many properties, my father interjected, as if this justified their actions. You wouldn't even miss one. And your sister needs help right now. The audacity was breathtaking. I stared at him, trying to process his logic. So because I've been successful, I owe Madison a massive gift? Because I worked hard and made good investments, I'm obligated to hand over the fruits of my labor to someone who's never demonstrated financial responsibility? Don't talk about your sister that way, my mother snapped, her tears suddenly drying up. She's going through a difficult time. She's 28 years old and has never held a job for more than 8 months, I replied. Her difficult time is the natural consequence of her choices, just like my success is the result of mine. Madison's face crumpled. I knew you always thought you were better than me. This isn't about better or worse, I said, frustrated by the deflection. It's about the fact that Mom and Dad announced I was giving you an apartment that I have no intention of giving you. It's about them making decisions about my assets without consulting me. We were trying to help both of you, my mother insisted. You've always struggled to be generous, Jessica. We thought this would be a beautiful moment of sisterly connection. The characterization stung despite its absurdity. Generous? I've been self-sufficient since I was 16 so you could pour resources into Madison. I worked through college while you paid her tuition and rent. I built my business without a dollar of family support. And now I'm struggling to be generous because I won't give away a property worth more than most people make in 5 years? My father's expression shifted from anger to calculation. No one's saying you have to give it to her outright. You could let her live there and still maintain ownership. She'd be a caretaker of sorts. A non-paying caretaker for a property that currently brings in $36,000 a year in rental income? I shook my head in disbelief. Dad, you're an accountant. You understand the financial absurdity of what you're suggesting. Family is more important than money, my mother declared with righteous certainty. This isn't about money versus family, I countered. It's about respect and boundaries. If family were truly your priority, you would respect my right to make decisions about my own property instead of making public announcements designed to pressure me into compliance. Madison had begun to cry softly, always her fallback when confrontations didn't go her way. I just need a fresh start, she said between sobs. After everything with Tyler. I felt my resolve wavering, the lifetime habit of giving in to keep the peace tugging at me. Then I remembered Derek waiting outside, believing in my worth even when my family didn't. I remembered the nights spent spackling and painting, the steep learning curve of property management, the pride I felt with each successful renovation. Madison, I said, my tone gentler but still firm, I understand you're going through a difficult transition. But my properties are not the solution to your problems. Then what am I supposed to do? She wailed. Live with Mom and Dad forever? You could get a stable job. Find an apartment within your budget. Learn to manage your finances. I listed the obvious steps she'd been avoiding. I'm happy to help you develop those skills, but I won't enable financial dependence. My father scoffed. Always so practical and cold. Your sister needs emotional support right now, not a lecture on financial responsibility. I'm offering real help, I insisted. Teaching her to be self-sufficient would be true support. Giving her a free apartment would just continue the pattern that got her into this situation. My mother stood up abruptly. I think you should leave. You've made your point and ruined your father's retirement dinner in the process. The familiar guilt trip almost worked, almost. But something had fundamentally shifted inside me during that public toast. I was done contorting myself to accommodate their unreasonable expectations. I didn't ruin anything, I said calmly, gathering my purse. You created this situation when you decided to announce a major financial decision on my behalf without my consent. I simply corrected the record. As I moved toward the door, Madison called after me, her voice small. So you're really not going to help me at all? I turned back one last time. I offered to help you develop financial literacy and independence. That offer stands. What I won't do is give you a free apartment. The choice of which kind of help you want to accept is yours. The walk to the front door felt longer than usual, the weight of decades of family dynamics heavy on my shoulders. Derek stood up from the porch swing as I emerged, concern written across his face. "How did it go?" he asked, taking my hand. "About as well as could be expected," I replied, the emotional exhaustion finally catching up with me. "Let's go home." As we drove away from my parents' house, I felt both drained and strangely liberated. For the first time in my life, I had publicly refused to diminish myself for my family's comfort. The consequences remained to be seen, but regardless of what came next, I knew I would never go back to being the compliant daughter who accepted less than she deserved. The morning after the disastrous dinner, my phone lit up with a barrage of text messages and missed calls. My parents had called 4 times before 8 a.m. Madison had sent a series of increasingly emotional texts, ranging from anger, "I can't believe you embarrassed me like that," to bargaining, "Maybe we could work something out where I pay a small amount of rent," to self-pity, "I guess I'll just be homeless since no one wants to help me." I silenced notifications and made coffee, sitting at my kitchen island to process the previous night's events. Derek had stayed over, offering quiet support without pushing me to talk. He understood I needed space to sort through my feelings. "Any regrets?" he asked, joining me with his own cup of coffee. I considered the question carefully. About setting the record straight? No. About doing it publicly? Maybe a slight twinge. But they created the public situation, I just responded to it. "For what it's worth, I thought you handled it with remarkable composure," Derek said. "Many people would have completely lost it in that situation." Around noon, I finally listened to my parents' voicemails. My father's message was terse: "Call us when you're ready to discuss this like adults." My mother's was predictably emotional: "I don't understand how you could humiliate your sister like that. We raised you better than this, Jessica." The fact that they still saw me as the problem was illuminating. In their narrative, my refusal to give Madison an apartment was the issue, not their presumptuous announcement of a gift that didn't exist. I decided to give everyone some cooling-off time before engaging further. This strategy lasted approximately 4 hours, until my doorbell rang unexpectedly at 3:30 p.m. Through the peephole, I saw my parents standing in the hallway, their expressions set in identical masks of determination. Madison stood slightly behind them, looking uncomfortable. I considered not answering but realized postponing the confrontation wouldn't make it easier. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. "We need to talk," my father announced without preamble. "I agree," I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "But I want to be clear that I'm not changing my mind about the apartment." They filed into my living room, my mother looking around with a critical eye at the contemporary decor I'd chosen, another subtle reminder that my taste, like my choices, never quite met with her approval. "Sit down, please," I said, gesturing to the sofa and armchairs. I remained standing, maintaining the position of authority in my own home. My father wasted no time on pleasantries. "Your behavior last night was completely unacceptable. You embarrassed your mother and me in front of the entire family." "I disagree," I said calmly. "You put me in an impossible position by announcing a major financial gift I never agreed to make. I simply clarified the situation. You could have gone along with it for one night and discussed it with us privately later," my mother argued, as if this were a reasonable alternative. "So I should have lied to our entire family?" I asked. "Pretended to give away hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep up appearances?" "You're being dramatic about the value," my father said dismissively. "And yes, sometimes in families, we make sacrifices to maintain harmony." "The sacrifices in this family have consistently flowed in one direction," I pointed out. "From me to Madison." Madison, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "That's not fair, Jessica. Mom and Dad have always supported both of us." I turned to her, incredulous. "Really?" They paid your college tuition while I worked 2 jobs to cover mine. They gave you $5,000 to start a business that failed in 3 months. They're currently housing you rent-free at 28. What exactly have you sacrificed? Don't attack your sister, my mother snapped. This isn't about Madison. Actually, it is, I countered. This is about the pattern of expecting me to achieve independently while cushioning Madison from the consequences of her choices. My father shifted tactics, his voice softening in the way it did when he was trying to persuade rather than command. Jessica, we understand you've worked hard for what you have. And we're incredibly proud of your success. But family supports each other in times of need. I agree, I said. But support doesn't mean giving away valuable assets. It can mean helping Madison develop the skills to support herself. I have skills, Madison protested weakly. My communications degree has led to how many stable jobs? I asked. How many have you left because they were too stressful or not fulfilling enough or had bad vibes? She looked away, unable to counter the point. My father leaned forward, his expression earnest. Here's what we're proposing. Madison moves into one of your properties, perhaps not Baker Street if that's too valuable to you. She can pay you a reduced rent, something symbolic, until she gets back on her feet. And how long would this arrangement last? I asked, already knowing the answer. Well, until she's stable, of course, my mother replied vaguely. Define stable. They exchanged glances, clearly having not thought through this detail. That's what I thought, I said. This isn't about a temporary helping hand. It's about creating another situation where Madison doesn't have to face adult responsibilities. Madison suddenly burst into tears, not the quiet, dignified kind, but loud, attention-grabbing sobs. You've always been jealous of me. You think I'm some kind of failure just because I haven't found my passion yet. I waited for her crying to subside, refusing to be manipulated by the familiar tactic. I don't think you're a failure, Madison. I think you've never been allowed to fail, which is different. Every time you've faced a challenge, Mom and Dad have stepped in to shield you from consequences. That's what parents do, my mother insisted. We protect our children. No, that's what you've done for Madison, I corrected. With me, you've expected self-sufficiency from the beginning. Which, ironically, has served me well, but the double standard has been painful to live with. My father stood up, pacing the room with mounting frustration. So you're refusing to help your sister out of some perceived childhood rivalry? That's incredibly petty, Jessica. The accusation stung, but I held my ground. This isn't about rivalry. It's about enabling versus actual help. And if we're being honest, it's also about something else. What? My father demanded. Money, I said simply. Madison has debts, doesn't she? More than just the aftermath of the breakup with Tyler. Madison's sobbing abruptly stopped, her expression shifting to alarm. My parents exchanged another significant look. What are you talking about? My mother asked, her voice unnaturally high. Credit card debt? Failed business ventures? Loans? I pressed. Is that why you're so desperate to secure her free housing? Madison looked at the floor. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Madison has had some financial challenges, he admitted reluctantly. She owes about $30,000 in credit card debt. And there was the online boutique that didn't work out. And she tried to start a podcast network with some friends. They signed a year-long lease on studio space, but the project fell apart after 2 months. So this isn't just about housing, I said, the pieces falling into place. It's about freeing up her income, or yours, to address these debts. We're trying to help her start fresh, my mother said defensively. Is that so wrong? Helping isn't wrong, I replied. But expecting me to solve problems I had no part in creating is. And announcing I'd give away my property without my consent was completely inappropriate. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. For perhaps the first time, my parents seemed to be considering my perspective. Madison spoke up, her voice small. I didn't know about the debts when they told me you were giving me an apartment. I thought you were just being nice. I looked at her skeptically. You believed I randomly decided to give you a $500,000 property out of niceness? She had the grace to look embarrassed. When they said it, I was excited. I didn't think about how unrealistic it was. My father sat back down, looking suddenly tired. We thought it would all work out once it was announced. That you'd see how happy it made Madison and go along with it. You thought I'd be pressured into compliance, I translated. That I wouldn't want to look bad in front of the family by taking back a gift that was already announced. He didn't deny it. That manipulation might have worked on the old Jessica, I continued. The one who always acquiesced to keep the peace. But I've spent years building my business and my confidence. I won't be manipulated anymore, not even by my parents. My mother's expression hardened. So you're just going to let your sister struggle while you live in luxury? How can you be so heartless? Derek chose that moment to return from the errand he'd been running, entering with a quiet hello that immediately changed the dynamic in the room. Derek, my mother said with forced brightness. We're just having a family discussion. I heard, he said simply, moving to stand beside me in a silent show of support. His presence seemed to deflate my parents' aggressive stance. My father stood again, gathering his coat. I can see we're not going to resolve this today. Jessica, I hope you'll reconsider your position. Madison is your sister, after all. I have reconsidered, I said. And I'm willing to help Madison, just not by giving her an apartment. Madison looked up. What do you mean? I mean, I'll help you develop financial literacy. I'll connect you with career counseling resources. I'll even help you find an apartment you can actually afford. But I won't enable financial dependence. My mother scoffed. That's not help. Actually, Derek interjected quietly, that sounds like real help to me. Teaching someone to be self-sufficient is more valuable than a temporary bailout. My father shot him an irritated glance before turning back to me. We'll discuss this again when everyone's had time to calm down. As they moved toward the door, Madison hung back. Can I talk to you alone for a minute? She asked me. Surprised, I nodded, walking her to the entryway while my parents waited in the hallway. Did you really not know they hadn't talked to me about the apartment? I asked when we were out of earshot. She bit her lip. I suspected. They were vague about it, saying you had essentially agreed or that it was practically a done deal. But I wanted it to be true, so I didn't question it too closely. It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I'm really in trouble, Jess, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The debts are worse than Dad said. And I don't know how to fix it. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in my sister's eyes. Not the manufactured distress she typically deployed to get her way, but real, adult fear. My offer stands, I said. Not an apartment, but help learning to stand on your own feet. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. As the door closed behind them, I leaned against it, emotionally drained from the confrontation. You okay? Derek asked, pulling me into a hug. Not yet, I admitted. But I will be. The week after the confrontation brought radio silence from my parents. This wasn't unexpected, the silent treatment had always been part of their repertoire when I failed to meet their expectations. Madison, however, sent a text 3 days later, can we meet for coffee? Just us. We arranged to meet at a cafe near my office, neutral territory. I arrived to find Madison already there, no designer handbag in sight, dressed more simply than her usual carefully curated style. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from confronting difficult truths rather than just missing sleep. Thanks for coming, she said as I sat down. I wasn't sure you would. Why wouldn't I? I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. She shrugged. After everything. I thought you might be done with all of us. I'm setting boundaries, not cutting ties, I clarified. There's a difference. The server brought my coffee, and for a moment, we sat in awkward silence, two adults who had grown up in the same house but existed in different realities. I've been thinking about what you said, Madison finally began. About mom and dad shielding me from consequences. I think you're right. Her admission surprised me. Madison rarely acknowledged fault or accepted criticism. The thing is, she continued, I never asked to be the favorite. It just happened, and then it became expected. Like I was playing a role in the family dynamic. The golden child to my responsible one, I said, understanding exactly what she meant. Yeah. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. But the thing about being the golden child is that it doesn't actually prepare you for anything. It's like I was praised just for existing, so I never developed the drive to achieve anything specific. Her self-awareness was unexpected and, frankly, impressive. I talked to Aunt Sarah yesterday, Madison continued. She said some things that were hard to hear about how mom and dad have treated us differently. She's noticed it for years but didn't think it was her place to say anything. What made her speak up now? Your toast, actually. Madison gave a small, wry smile. She said it was like watching someone finally name the elephant in the room that everyone had been pretending not to see. I took a sip of my coffee, processing this new information. So what happens now? Madison straightened her shoulders, a gesture that reminded me, unexpectedly, of myself. I made an appointment with a credit counselor. And I'm interviewing for a receptionist position at a dental office next week. It's not glamorous, but it's stable. Benefits, regular hours. That's really great, Madison. Don't sound so shocked, she said, but there was no real bite to her words. I can be responsible when I have to be. I know you can, I replied, and was surprised to discover I meant it. You've just rarely had to be. We talked for another hour, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. Madison told me about the full extent of her financial troubles, which were worse than our father had admitted. Between credit card debt, the failed business ventures, and some questionable investment choices Tyler had convinced her to make, she was nearly $50,000 in the hole. I won't ask you for money, she said firmly. That's not why I wanted to meet. I could use some advice. You're good with finances, obviously. And I'm, well, not. I found myself genuinely wanting to help her, not out of obligation or to keep the peace, but because she was asking for the right kind of help. Let's make a plan, I said, pulling out a notebook. Step by step. By the time we parted, we had outlined a practical approach to her debt, complete with a realistic budget and timeline. It would take work and sacrifice, but it was doable. And for the first time in our adult lives, I felt like we were relating as equals rather than as the responsible sister and the perpetual child. Thank you, Madison said as we walked out. Not just for the financial advice, but for, I don't know, seeing me as capable of more than I'd been showing. It was a moment of connection I hadn't expected, fragile but real. The situation with my parents took longer to evolve. Uncle James called a few days after my coffee with Madison, his tone uncommonly serious. Your father is pretty worked up about this whole apartment situation, he said without preamble. I imagine he is, I replied neutrally. Thing is, Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said at the dinner. About building your business without support. There was a pause. I want you to know that I see how hard you've worked. And what Robert and Eleanor tried to do, announcing you were giving away property without your consent, that wasn't right. His validation meant more than I expected. Thank you for saying that. Your grandmother tore into them after you left, by the way, he added, a hint of admiration in his voice. Said they'd always had different rules for you and Madison, and it was about time someone called them on it. The image of my 83-year-old grandmother reading my parents the riot act made me smile despite everything. She's always been direct. She has indeed. Uncle James cleared his throat. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that not everyone in the family thinks you're in the wrong here. Stand your ground, kid. My mother broke her silence a week later with a text that read only, "Sunday dinner? Just family." I agreed, with some trepidation. The dinner was as tense as expected. My father maintained a cool civility, speaking to me only when necessary. My mother vacillated between forced cheerfulness and wounded sighs. Madison, to her credit, seemed determined to forge a new path, mentioning her upcoming job interview and the budget we'd created without prompting. "You're really taking the receptionist job?" my mother asked, looking perplexed. "But you have a communications degree." "It's a starting point," Madison replied with unexpected maturity. "Stable income, benefits, regular hours. I can look for something in my field once I've got my finances under control." My father glanced between us suspiciously. "Have you two been talking?" "We had coffee," I confirmed. Madison asked for financial advice, and I gave it. "That's your idea of helping? A budget?" My mother couldn't keep the disdain from her voice. "Actually," Madison interjected before I could respond, "it's exactly the help I needed. Jessica's been really supportive." The look of confusion on my parents' faces might have been comical in another context. They clearly couldn't reconcile their golden child accepting, even appreciating, a solution that involved work rather than a bailout. "Well," my father said after an uncomfortable pause, "I suppose if that's what you want, Madison." "It is," she said firmly. "I'm 28. It's time I learned to stand on my own feet." My mother looked like she wanted to argue but held her tongue, a rare exercise in restraint that suggested she recognized the shifting dynamic between her daughters. After dinner, my father asked to speak with me privately. We stepped onto the back porch, the spring evening cool but pleasant. "Your sister seems to have taken your advice to heart," he said, clearly struggling with this development. "She made her own decisions," I replied. "I just offered perspective." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard where we'd played as children. "I still think you could have handled the retirement dinner differently. Less publicly." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as my father was likely to come to acknowledging his role in the situation. "And I think you could have handled the apartment idea differently," I countered. "Like actually discussing it with me before announcing it to the entire family." He winced slightly but nodded. Point taken. We stood in silence for a while longer, the unspoken history of favoritism and unequal expectations hanging between us. It wouldn't be resolved in one conversation, or perhaps ever completely, but something had shifted. "Your business is doing well?" he asked finally, an olive branch of sorts. "Very well," I said. "I'm closing on a mixed-use development next month. Commercial space on the ground floor, apartments above." "That's impressive, Jessica." The admission seemed to cost him something, but it was genuine. "You've built something substantial on your own." "Yes," I said simply. "I have." Over the next few months, the family dynamic continued to evolve. Madison started her receptionist job and stuck with it, gradually paying down her debts. She found an affordable apartment in a less trendy but safe neighborhood, and I helped her negotiate the lease terms. We began having regular sisterly dinners, building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than comparative value. My parents adjusted to the new reality with varying degrees of success. My mother still occasionally made comments about how I could do more to help Madison, but these became less frequent as Madison demonstrated her growing independence. My father, surprisingly, developed a newfound interest in my business, occasionally asking substantive questions about property management and investment strategies. 4 months after the disastrous retirement dinner, my parents hosted a smaller family gathering, just the four of us plus Derek, who had become a steadfast support through the entire process. The atmosphere was more relaxed than it had been in years, the old patterns disrupted enough to allow new interactions to emerge. After dinner, Madison pulled me aside. "I wanted to show you something," she said, handing me a small notebook. Inside was a meticulous tracking of her debt payments, the total reduced by nearly a third through careful budgeting and consistent work. "Madison, this is fantastic," I said, genuinely impressed. "I couldn't have done it without your help," she replied. "Not the apartment kind of help, but the real kind. Teaching me instead of rescuing me." "You did the hard part," I told her. "You showed up and did the work." She smiled, a genuine expression free from the performative quality that had characterized so many of our interactions. "Turns out I'm actually pretty good at managing details when I try. The dentist has been giving me more responsibilities beyond reception. Said I have an eye for organization." "That doesn't surprise me at all," I said. "You've always been smart, you just needed the chance to apply it." Later, as Derek and I drove home, he asked, "Do you think things will ever be completely normal with your family?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't think they'll ever be what society calls normal. There's too much history there. But I think we're finding a new normal, one with healthier boundaries and more honest communication." "And how do you feel about that?" I watched the city lights pass by outside the window, reflecting on the journey of the past few months. Grateful for the progress. Cautiously optimistic about the future. And really proud of standing my ground when it would have been easier to give in. Derek reached over to take my hand. "You should be proud. You broke a pattern that's probably existed for generations in your family. That takes real courage." As we pulled into the parking garage of my building, the building I'd purchased with my own money, renovated with my own hands, and refused to give away despite immense pressure, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for most of my life. I had finally stopped seeking validation from people who had never been able to see my true worth, and in doing so, had created space for more authentic relationships to grow. The irony wasn't lost on me that by refusing to give Madison an apartment, I had given her something far more valuable, the opportunity to discover her own capability and strength. And in standing firm against my parents' manipulation, I had opened the door to a more honest relationship with them, one based on who we actually were rather than the roles we had been assigned. Some family wounds may never fully heal, but they had begun to scar over, creating a tougher but more resilient connection. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And after a lifetime of performative harmony at my expense, reality was a gift I deeply appreciated. 6 months after the toast that changed everything, I stood in the entryway of Madison's new apartment, helping her hang curtains in the living room. It wasn't one of my properties, it was a modest one-bedroom in a well-maintained building with reasonable rent that she had found herself. The furniture was a mix of budget-friendly new pieces and thoughtfully selected second-hand finds. Nothing extravagant, but everything chosen with intention and paid for with her own money. "What do you think?" she asked, stepping back to assess our handiwork. "Too high on the left?" I tilted my head, considering. "Maybe an inch lower." "Here, hold the ladder." As I made the adjustment, I reflected on how much had changed since that fateful retirement dinner. Madison had not only kept her receptionist job but had been promoted to office manager after demonstrating unexpected aptitude for systems organization and patient relations. Her credit card debt was now more than halfway paid off, and she had started a small emergency fund, a concept that would have been foreign to her a year ago. "Perfect," she declared as I descended the ladder. "That really pulls the room together." "It does look good," I agreed, genuinely impressed by the home she was creating for herself. "You have a better eye for design than I do." She laughed. "Maybe I should have studied interior design instead of communications. Though honestly, I'm finding I actually like the work at the dental office. It's satisfying to keep things running smoothly, to solve problems before they become crises." "That's what property management is like for me," I said, realizing we had found a point of connection in our different paths. "There's something deeply satisfying about creating order and function." Madison nodded, understanding in her eyes that wouldn't have been there before. "I get that now. I really do." We ordered takeout and sat on her new sofa, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had. There was an authenticity to our relationship now. We were getting to know each other as adults rather than as the roles we'd been assigned in childhood. Mom called yesterday, Madison mentioned between bites of pad thai. She wanted to know if I was coming to Sunday dinner. Are you? I asked, curious about her response. Madison shrugged. I told her I would, but that I'd have to leave early for a movie with friends. Setting some boundaries, like you said. How did she take it? There was the usual guilt trip attempt, we hardly see you anymore, but I just repeated that I'd be there for dinner but had plans after. Madison smiled slightly. It's getting easier to stick to my boundaries. It does get easier, I agreed. Though I still find myself slipping into old patterns sometimes. Like last week when Dad called asking for your professional opinion on refinancing their mortgage? Madison raised an eyebrow knowingly. I laughed. Exactly like that. 3 hours of research I wasn't planning to do. But you're getting better too, she pointed out. You told Mom you couldn't babysit Aunt Sarah's kids last minute. Small steps, I acknowledged. Our parents had made their own halting progress over the past 6 months. There were still moments of tension, still occasions when the old expectations surfaced, but there was also a growing recognition, sometimes reluctant, sometimes genuine, of our autonomy and boundaries. My father had slowly developed a gruff respect for my business acumen, occasionally asking substantive questions about property values or investment strategies. My mother still struggled more with the new dynamic, particularly with Madison's independence, but even she had begun to adjust her expectations. Do you think they'll ever fully understand? Madison asked, setting down her fork. I considered the question carefully. Completely? Probably not. They're products of their own upbringing and patterns. But I think they're learning to respect our choices, even when they don't fully understand them. That's something, at least, Madison said. Better than where we were. Later that evening, as I drove home to meet Derek for our own dinner plans, I reflected on the broader lessons of the past 6 months. The confrontation at my father's retirement dinner had been painful but necessary, a breaking point that allowed healthier patterns to emerge from the wreckage of old expectations. I had learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but essential, that enabling wasn't the same as helping, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices. Madison had learned that she was capable of far more than she'd been allowed to believe, that independence brought both challenges and profound satisfaction, and that her worth wasn't dependent on being the family favorite. Our parents were learning, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, that their daughters were adults with the right to make their own decisions, even when those decisions didn't align with parental preferences. They were learning that respect was a two-way street, that manipulation ultimately undermined rather than strengthened family bonds. At home, Derek had prepared a simple dinner, opening a bottle of wine as I shared the details of my day with Madison. She's really changing, he observed. You both are. We're finding our way to a different kind of relationship, I agreed. One that's based on who we actually are rather than the roles we were assigned. I'm proud of you, he said, raising his glass in a toast. Standing your ground at that dinner took courage. But the real courage has been in the daily work of reshaping these relationships without burning them to the ground. His words captured exactly what I'd been feeling, that the real victory wasn't in the dramatic moment of the toast but in the patient, consistent work of building something healthier from the ashes of old patterns. 6 months ago, I had stood up at a family dinner and refused to give my sister an apartment that my parents had promised without my consent. It had been a moment of crisis, of patterns breaking beyond repair. But from that broken place, something more authentic had begun to grow, not perfect, not without struggle, but real and rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation. The journey wasn't over. Family patterns have deep roots, and there would be more challenges ahead as we all continued to adjust to new ways of relating. But for perhaps the first time in my life, I was engaging with my family as my authentic self rather than the role I'd been assigned. And in doing so, I had discovered that true family connection isn't about maintaining appearances or meeting arbitrary expectations, it's about seeing each other clearly and choosing to remain connected despite our differences. As I raised my glass to join Derek's toast, I felt a deep sense of peace. The path hadn't been easy, but it had led to something genuine, and that was worth far more than any apartment could ever be. Have you ever had to stand up against family pressure to protect your boundaries? Or maybe you've been on Madison's side of the equation, learning to become more independent? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to stand up for themselves, even when it's difficult. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the most valuable gift we can give each other isn't material at all, but the space and support to grow into our strongest, most authentic selves.